The last and final session of this book. Also, as I was uploading, I noticed I can track my haircuts by these videos that I upload. It does grow. It goes way too fast. Okay, well, again, thank you for struggling through this whole. I am going to give you just a general overview and just to remind you of where we're at in the book and how he builds it. And I won't go into any real major detail about it. I'm just going to use the table of contents, but we've talked a lot about this book and the idea. This was written again as probably some sort of project and getting published as a part of a series. It has been, it really is meant to be a Cliff Note version of Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, which argues, the larger argument that behind that book is we have lost a virtue-based ethic. And we have come to a place in society where we judge things on our emotion and our personal preferences rather than a tradition of virtue that held people accountable to one another and to the communal practices that both defined them and gave rise to a sense of excellence of who we are as people. And that happens through, and he believes, and really McIntyre wasn't even writing that necessarily explicitly for the church, save for the fact he's writing in a Western context coming from Europe and extending to the US. And you can't get away from Judeo-Christian ethics or Judeo-Christian morals and talk about any form of ethics in anyone in any Western culture. You just can't. All of Western culture is informed by Christianity. And honestly, even for atheists to say, oh, I want to live in a godless society, or you can't. You then move out of this country because you'll never get away, even if you strip away the explicit Christian and sort of spiritual practices. That underlying moral ethic of how we understand our lives and relationships with one another is governed purely by Judaism and its extension, Christianity. No, well, you'd have to go to.
There isn't anywhere else.
Well, that you'd want to go. I mean, in other words, you can go to, you can go to the Philippines if you want, but they're not. Well, actually, they've been influenced by Western too. You can go to some island in Papua New Guinea, and I'm sure you'll get their culture, but you can escape the morality that exists here. Because morality is an expression of culture, save for the fact that we as Christians believe that God, restored the spirit to all of humanity to some extent. Restoring our rationality, restoring our ability to be empathetic and to connect and to relate.
How long ago did he write the book?
McIntyre, I believe in the 80s.
In the 80s.
90s. I'm not even sure. I should know that.
So he saw this coming a long time ago.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'll tell you the stuff. There is some stuff about what's going. Yeah, because if you study history, I mean, the historians right now and sociologists say, and the theologians too, would say that we are mirroring Rome in the 5th, 6th century, and in the sense of the destruction of a uniform.
Go down.
And well, it is, and that's why he ends, and that's what he starts this chapter with today, was this notion of we're waiting for another Saint Benedict, because it was in the fall of Rome that Saint Benedict went off and founded a community outside of Rome. Yes.
He makes that statement, or probably McIntyre, and then it's repeated in this book. Where's the evidence for that?
For what?
That we're entering this dark age. He says it at the beginning of the final chapter also. And I just think, I'm not sure I agree with that. Oh yeah, he's quoting McIntyre here. What matters at this stage is the construction of, well, excuse me, I want to start.
Just the big paragraph that starts the chapter. Hold that thought then, because we're going to come to that.
Okay.
And we'll talk explicitly about that, because we're going to read that, and I'm going to walk you through the whole paragraph. So is that okay to hold on that? So let me just give you a walkthrough of what brings us to this chapter today. And literally like a walkthrough in like a sentence or two. So Living with Our History, chapter 1 is just, if you wanted to summarize that, he wants us to acknowledge that society as a whole has to acknowledge that everything is contextual in relationship to history. So you can't say anything started afresh and new. Now there, he does give sort of a break to some extent to Jesus' entry into the world and the sort of new world order. And there are places where you have those things that almost are new in beginning, but that you can't ever divorce a person from their background, from their culture, from where they came from. And that always comes into play. And that's what plays history out. And saying as a church, we can't be ashamed of our past because one, we didn't contribute it actively, but two, we also have to own that past and acknowledge that it's there. So there are atrocities, and really we gain validity to the world by saying, yeah, that's not how we're supposed to be. It didn't, we can only be responsible for what we know now, but we can be responsible for making sure it doesn't happen again. So living with our history is sort of situating ourselves in the fact and accepting the premise that history shapes us and we are shaped by the cultures that we're in. Two, fragmented worlds is where he introduces the idea of fragmentation, that we're not a pluralist world, that where everything is just like, oh, we all believe different things and we all coexist and that's great. That would be more of a utopian ideal. But instead we exist in a place where we have differing views because we have only fragments of moral systems and influences in our past. And that even now we have to take those fragments and try to negotiate. I think the best example of that is I said this on Sunday, I believe my generation, the Xers were the generate. Prior to that, everyone kind of went to church. No matter who you were, you just went. My generation was the generation who we were the first program to, and then we were the first sort of after college or after high school to sort of, I'm gonna wander. We were the first sort of spiritual, not religious. But the difference is we still had kids usually before the age of 30. So we had a prolonged we married later, we did a little more education, and we ended up marrying and having kids later. And so there was this return by my generation in their early 30s to the church, not because we sought spirituality, actually, but because we didn't know how to raise our children morally. So we brought our kids to church so the church could make them moral human beings. You see that, as being a youth minister most of my life, the amount of parents who would just drop their kids off for Sunday school and go home, it's like, what are you doing here? Like, what do you say? What are you saying to your kids? And so it's no wonder we're in a situation where some of you might have done that yourself, and that's okay. So that's what people did at the time. But that notion of let my kid decide what they want to do. I'm just going to leave them at church. I want them to have a good time at church. This is, so sort of attractional model ministry became huge. If your kids are happy, then they'll like church. But we realize that's not the case. So why do we go to church? Well, we want our kids. I mean, that's why we're kind of at now. People are saying, well, do you take your kids to church? Do you force them to go to church? I don't want my kids to hate to go to church. I want them to, So we're in this battle, and that's all fragments of what was. And even the desire to have the church be the moral center shows you that influence of the Enlightenment. They're not bringing their kids to be moral or to be spiritually formed, which does include morality. In the end, they just want their kids to have some sense of morality, which is expressed in millennial spirituality, which I've said before is called moral therapy. They call it moral therapeutic deism. The millennials go to church because they believe that's where they're told what's right and wrong. They go to church, the therapeutic side.
They go for those reasons, not to know really about Jesus. But
No, yeah. So in 2000, in the late 90s, early 2000s, Christian Smith out of North Carolina University, who's a religious sociologist, began the largest study of youth and young adult spirituality in the history of civilization. It included a sample of 8,000, 10,000. They started at the mass number and got it down to several thousand. And for every 5 years, they followed this cohort of young people and all across the country, all different, demographics, incomes, and race, and everything, and denominations. And they're tracking their spirituality every 5 years. So that dollar. He came back and he's like, they're still here. Can't get those cookies. But what and there was all sorts of wonderful things that were learned from this, and they continue to learn from it. But the initial findings showed that they're studying millennials. that the dominant religious understanding of millennials was what they called moral therapeutic deism. And it was moral because they believed that these young people believed that when they went to church, that they would discover what was right or wrong there, or that's where they would have some framework for what is right and wrong. Because they don't have that in culture. There's so much moral ambiguity. You don't judge people for their morals. So the church is a standard. Now they can either accept or reject that, but the church still stands as that. Therapeutic in the sense of church is meant to make you feel good. You go to church in the youth group and you come out and they hype you up and they make you feel good and you feel good about Jesus and life, and helps you reconcile the dark things in our lives and feel better about those, that God is with us. And so there's that therapeutic side. And then the deistic side is that God is real. Young millennials don't deny they're the least atheist of the three generations of boomer, millennial, and Xers. But they believe God's there, but they don't believe God really is. Like, it's more of a Greek notion where God's up there, but their daily actions don't really need to reflect anything. So it's spiritual that God's up there, but not religious. I'm not going to express in any organized way. So that's pretty much how they describe millennial spirituality. And my connection to all of that in my generational studies is each of those pieces of, and we'll talk more about this winter, where we're going to dig around it a little bit more, but that moral side comes from the silent generation, who was the last generation where there was an absolute right and wrong. This was in modernity still, where citizenship was good Christian. Christian, if you're a good Christian, you're a good citizen, good Christian. It was just sort of, you have a moral duty, an ethic that drives you. So that moral right and wrong absolute comes from that generation's influence of saying this is what the church is. You have the boomer generation, that's the therapeutic generation. And they didn't abandon church altogether. The boomer generation said, let's improve it. So, but their improvements ended up sort of relying on a consumeristic model of church. So it became prisma of personality, became lights and drums and guitars and show and flash and screens and bouncy castles and McDonald's playgrounds outside and barbershops. And my sister, she goes to a church that has a playground in it and a barbershop, and they do wonderful things. That's not a critique of that. I'm not saying it has to be bad, but the church became this programmatic entity expression. And then the millennial, and then my generation, and we were the first to sort of experience that. My generation, the Xers, we're a deistic generation. We're reality bites. Kurt Cobain, suicide became sexy for us. We wore goth and grunge became our signature dress. We became this downtrodden generation, and and we viewed God as being this distant being. And you see it through the literature, you see it through the music, you see it through cultural icons like Kurt Cobain. I mean, and you ask, why would that be? Why would we have such? Well, my connection to that generation would be, we were the first generation that were called latchkey kids, meaning we let ourselves back in the house and home. Our parents.
That's where we messed up. It's when mom was taken out of the house, because that was the backbone of America.
There's a lot of argument for that, and it's unfortunately it puts women in a challenge where they have to choose a career at home in a way that's unfair. But I think a latchkey kid doesn't mean it's not just. I wouldn't say it's just women going to work. It's also the breakdown of generations. And sometime in between the silent generation and the boomer generation, we see the emergence of adult living communities, or not just nursing homes for health reasons. There have always been like medical reasons. Someone gets to the age where they need to live and they need medical attention all the time. They go into a nursing home because they need a nurse there 24/7. But in the last century, we started developing this idea that adults should, in their elder years, should live together in communities like college students. And now, being the representative for the denomination for the PCUSA, I was representing I represented the denomination to the organizations that do this. The money that are in these adult living communities, it's like a dorm. There's parties every night. You can go to the cafeteria. It's a la carte, choose what you want. You have declining balance. There's a little yogurt shop over there in the corner. There's a coffee shop on the grounds. If you need a little more help, they'll move you to a new facility in the same ground. And it's just this, it's this world unto itself. But I think that part of the latchkey thing was we started putting our elderly in homes. Because in previous generations, where middle-aged parents would have to work, and often multiple jobs to make ends meet, that my parents would be at home, and so the children would come to the parents, even in it. And so, but we were the latchkey kids. We came home alone, but Velveeta, and Scooby-Doo, and all, and watch cartoons, and and I think that sense of abandonment, quite frankly, and I don't feel that personally. My mom actually stayed home. But I think that feeling of abandonment translated into our understanding of who God is, because spiritual development, child psychology says the child's first understanding of a God figure is the parents. So they're always going to have that sense of, parent. Right? Divine parent is always is understood through the relationship of the human parent, which is why when you have parental abuse situations, it's oftentimes hard for children to really understand a loving, trusting parental figure. But I digress, but welcome to my world of, of Christian education. But we're going to talk about these things. Surprisingly, well, I'll get to that. Fragmented worlds, the failure of the Enlightenment Project. The Enlightenment Project is just that around the 1700s, you have some pretty big thinkers come on the scene and say, we don't need the church. This is on the tail end of the Reformation. So the Reformation said, we don't need the authority of the Catholic Church to tell us what to think. Sola Scriptura, the Bible. Now, and you got to take a step even back further. The reason this is happening is Gutenberg's printing press came on in 1444. Everyone starts printing German Bibles. They start to learn to read. Literacy grows. You get to the point where everyone's reading their own Bible. I'm like, I can interpret this. I don't need you. And so there's a Reformation that happens. The authority of the Catholic Church is questioned on a number of fronts. But out of this, you start to have intellectualism rise. And in that, people start thinking, I don't need the church to tell me how to think morally. Morality is something that is just within us, regardless of where God is in the situation. So that sense of a good person, the sense of I'm just a good person, or there's a general, Immanuel Kant, a philosopher, said that he called it the moral imperative. And that means that inside our human souls, that there is something that is just moral. And he wanted to divorce that from any sense of theology or God. But as Christians, we believe, again, in Pentecost, that was that sense of morality, that sense of knowing right and wrong that is in us, is the fulfillment of the prophecy, of the new prophecy that was found in Jeremiah. That God would write his law in our hearts, and we no longer would have to tell our brother or neighbor what is right or wrong. They will know for themselves. So because it's an Old Testament prophecy that we will get these sort of moral consciousness is so the failure of the Enlightenment Project was it didn't work. They thought that if they could ground morality in something that was in all of humanity, would make humanity generally moral. Because if we all can appeal to what is in us, then we can all do better. And that's that Platonic idea that if you know what is good, you'll do what is good. And so in our soul, in our moral spirits, if we know what is good, we'll just do it naturally. And obviously that presumes a few things about moral will and things like that. Chapter 4 was what he threw in his little resisting Nietzschean temptations. That was written for more the new monastic communities. I think that was the most convoluted chapter of it, right in the middle. And it really was addressing some of the temptations of new monasticism, being known, being popular, getting, that don't let it become, kitschy or, and trying to recover them. And I don't think there was a whole, and if I could take that chapter out, I would. Last week, we looked at recovering tradition, and that was the idea that prior to this Enlightenment Project failure, there was a tradition that held on to a gospel-oriented understanding of community and morality and ethics. And even though it had been fragmented through these, 1600 years of history, that there were still remnants of it that we could trace back. And for MacIntyre, the original source, he goes back to really the 12th and 13th century. But in general, they're basically saying that the way you recover tradition is by having what they were the top of my head. I don't know if I could even recite them. Virtues, he talked about the virtues were given by community. Virtues were things that were instilled in us as we grew older, and that were instilled in us from young age. And really, Augustine would have defined a virtue as the median. In other words, like not eating anything is bad because it's anorexia and it's skinny and it's an extreme, and being gluttonous down here on the other end is bad because, but in the middle, you find some sense of balance. And you can put this on any sort of, this is a spectrum, you can put on any sort of virtue or aspect of life. You pull it up and they have, greed on one side and poverty, or miserly to the point of poverty on the other. So you could have, because you're giving away money. So there's always a balance in the middle, and that's for where philosophers and Christian philosophers and theologians, that middle was where we found that sense of virtue. But that sense of virtue is developed within the community itself. A practice, McIntyre, both McIntyre and Wilson talked about, a practice is something that we do. And when we do this practice, as opposed to an activity, when we do a practice together, it gives goods, it produces goods, like things that are good about it, that are both make the excellence of the practice rise, and which is the internal good, and increase even the understanding of that practice itself. So excellence internally. And he makes the argument in that 5th chapter that these practices need to really happen within communities. So in other words, we stopped doing worship. I don't think it was you, Perry, maybe last year. Were you at Gold Hill last year when the candle was like flipped up in the air? Was that you? Were you there? Were you there? Not this past year, 2 years ago at Gold Hill, when I sat down on the bench and the candle shot up in the air, wax went everywhere. The camera fell. Someone, I don't remember who it was. Someone was there who said after the service, they were like, I can't believe that happened. And you didn't freak out. You just sort of picked stuff up and carried on. And I said, I said, wasn't you?
I wasn't here.
You weren't there. Well, or maybe maybe you saw it online. Did you see it? But I just sort of, and this is not to say I did a good job with it, but I have long let go of the idea that services are performative. So when mistakes happen, they happen. I forget my notes. Nothing I can do about that. I'm not gonna, I'm sorry. I'll go get my notes. I'll be back. And in the end, it doesn't change anything. But again, there are so many churches who want to make what they do on Sunday morning performative because it produces the external good of being, this or that, as opposed to the internal good of what we're doing here matters. And what we're doing here matters. I talked about sacred time a few weeks ago. This is sacred time. We're taking out of our normal lives to gather together to have meaningful discussion and learning and wrestling with ideas that matter to who we are as the church. What more holy thing can we do today? I have the privilege in my work to spend my day doing holy things. I'm sure I do some unholy things too, but there is some sense of what does it mean to be a community that does it, and those are the practices of a community. And so Wilson and McIntyre are saying we need to be in small clusters of communities that allow these practices to surface in such a way that they shape us and allow us to proclaim God's kingdom more faithfully.
Do you really think performative is? You see, I think you need some performative. You need a sermon or something, because you have to communicate, and if you don't do it effectively, and I've been in my church where as soon as the guy starts talking, it's so bad. So there has to be some performative aspect to that. Your sermon or your
yeah, but maybe not. I preach and teach pretty much the same way, so I'm not in any performance mode here. If you sat across my table with me at dinner time, we started talking about a theological concept, I would talk about it in other words,
your personality leads to that performative
Well, maybe it lends itself, or maybe my preaching and teaching style has been shaped by the conviction that it not ought to be performative.
Okay.
Because as someone who does have a theater background and grew up in the Assemblies of God, I do know how to preach in such a way that is more, I mean, I grew up in the Assemblies of God. We preached like black preachers because the Assemblies of God came out of the black church. So repetition and alliteration, and there's lots of things that they teach even in the Assemblies of God College, on how to be performative in that way. And in many ways, that's for teaching someone to function within the culture of a church. But I mean, I learned to preach by watching a Baptist preacher in Minneapolis, and
But by being performative, you give enthusiasm, and that enthusiasm inspires. And I think that's not a bad thing.
okay, well, thank you. I still don't think I'm performing for you.
That was in general.
No, yeah. No.
That's a bad word choice.
I'm sorry, I
No,
was
no.
thinking about the opposite of the small churches as the mega churches. And what kind of appeal that has and who that appeals to. It's almost like rock concerts and you wonder, that's very stimulating, but you wonder what people take away from that. If what do they get from that except a sort of a physical high?
It's in that good feeling.
It's emotionalism.
Emotional.
And I don't want to make spirituality devoid of emotions, because I do think we are human. Every other aspect of our life has emotion. And so why do we feel like if we have emotions and spirituality that somehow? But when leadership manipulates emotions, and coming in an environment, growing up in the Assemblies of God, I felt not only had I been manipulated, but I had manipulated young people into finding salvation, because you learn to know what to say. It's kind of like a pop psychology, through religion. But no, I understand what you're saying, but I do think that mega churches were probably not the idea. I don't know God's mind, and I don't want to judge mega churches because I think they have I don't like them. I worked in a mega Presbyterian church and saw the woes of it, and already knew them before I went there, but went there anyways. I think that the small clustered communities of people of faith living out faithfully in their own context in their small locality is really, if everyone in every context, in every town, got together with other Christians and said, how might we actually live out the kingdom of God in unity and love and in charity? I think we would transform the world. It's not a hard concept, but it takes.
Some of the mega churches, they are all about cell groups. So you may go on Sunday, Saturday, but they will emphasize, please join a small group. So I'm trying to say,
They recognize it themselves, and that's why they do
Life
it.
Church was started by Craig Rochelle. He was given no budget. He had 4 people on Friday night. He said, can I start a young singles? He had 80 people the next Friday in downtown Oklahoma City. There's something there. And I know. So I'm just saying, we are cell groups is what he will say, but he also has the whole.
Well, and that's the way
And I
that
don't want to pick on any individuals. I just know
No.
that there are a lot of people in Life Church in Oklahoma City. Their life is in their cell group, but they go to a mega church.
Right.
And that is what this in the book, we remember the managerial style. That is the managerial style of dealing. It's almost like we've made this mega church. We recognize you really can't have community that way. Let's return to an early church model. But rather than shifting the funds and the commitment and the time and the expression to a small group, they still hold the allegiance to the large group. And then they just meet. And it's not a bad way. Francis Chan had, Francis Chan wrote a book called Crazy Love, 1 million copies. Great book in a lot of ways. But he had this awakening to realize what this sort of satellite ministry with him as the center talking head of it all was not what he was called to. It basically broke it
He
broke
gave
the,
that up.
yeah, I was majorly impressed with him. All that's to say is, yeah, we are these are the things we're wrestling with. These are the fragmentations, you know, whether it's Joel Osteen and prosperity gospel, or it's a holiness movement like, you know, Francis Chan, but it gets to the point where it's driven in one direction or one expression. I do think that we're meant to be small churches. I think that there's something about that. I think there's connection and community and love, and that doesn't mean they can't grow and they won't grow, but I think if there are enough of them around, you're connecting with people because you're not just meeting them on church on Sunday. And I think we don't have this here because of the nature of Lake City, which is why we're looking at this book. But I think in suburban, you know, when I was when Lombard at Community Presbyterian Church there, ironically the same name that I started, people were just came on Sundays. The only time they ever saw anyone in church was on Sundays. And I don't know about you, but the last time I saw someone for maybe an hour and a half across the room a week each week, I didn't really have a great relationship with them. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that even within our own community, and we again different, it's transient community, but there are so many people within our own community that people don't know each other's names. And that's not, I mean, and that happens, that's everywhere. You know, that's why people wear name badges, because no one wants to be embarrassed to turn around to pass the piece to someone and be like, what's your name again? I know I just sat here behind you for the last 10 years. But when you only have an hour and a half intersection with them, is that really community? You know, is that an existence? Is that the spiritual existence that we believe that God wants the kingdom of God to be on this earth for us? An hour and a half check-in on Sunday.
Well, if you just sit there and go home afterwards and you don't even talk to each other, no.
Okay.
But if there are social times afterwards where you do get acquainted, over time, you do get to know people.
And that's what I'm saying is, and what you've just done is said, yeah, we extend that a little time, a little more. And I'm saying, okay, well then let's extend a little more. And we do. We have Wednesdays, we have Bible studies, we have these, and that's how we begin to create community. But even then, sometimes we in our culture, and again, I don't think this fully applies here, because I think the way we, in particular, the way we in the summer live our lives together is we're intersecting multiple times a week. That's what community is. We're hearing about things that are going on and engaging in a life together. In most suburban, urban contexts, that's not the case. You live your life during the week. You may go to a Bible study, you may be invited to a small group, but by and large, you maybe have 2 points of connection with your spiritual community. But really, if we want to take seriously what God is, and what Scripture is calling us to, it's a community that lives and dwells and breathes and intersects and has a daily interaction with one another, not a hour and a half a week intersection.
You know, when you travel all over Europe, you go to all around different towns and communities. Every single one, the focal point of the town is the church people.
Absolutely.
And you get the feeling that it's the center of life of the community.
Mhm.
And those are small, but they're not big sprawling urban things.
And sometimes they are, even in big towns, but then the cathedrals would accommodate the amount of people. That's why you have big cathedrals in downtown European cities, and that's why they had multiple services or masses, because there were so many people that had to come in. But that's why I love church bells. Church bells were not just, hey, we're getting things started, everyone be quiet. They went on for long. So in Taizé, they ring their bells from 8 to 10 minutes before prayers, and it is like, because wherever you're at on the property, if you hear that bell, you can hear them. Oh, it's time to go. Put our stuff down, and because you're orienting your life around this gathering point. I mean, if I could be honest and reveal and I don't know if it'll come to pass again, because I'm not here to implement my vision on this church. I'm meant to expose you to some of the things I've been exposed to and see what surfaces. But if I could implement something, I would love it if we rang the bell at noon every day and we all gathered. For those who were in a residential proximity to the church and could make it, we would stop what we were doing in the middle of our days and we would gather for 15, 20 minutes, 30, whatever we wanted to decide what it was. And for me, this is where the Taizé chants have always been instrumental. They're just sort of peaceful. They're not a lot of words. We're not collecting prayer requests. We're not interceding in that way. It's about dwelling together. So that when if we sit and we sing the lyrics or the prayer, Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom, we confess together. These things that just sitting and dwelling, even sitting and dwelling in peace. If you have a community that gathers at a point and does that, that is a practice of gathering around silence. And maybe you sit for 10 minutes in silence and you sing a song or a hymn or something, and then you depart and you go on your ways. But that centering, that daily intersection orients one's life towards living out a kingdom life, rather than saying, I'm going to live out my life and I'm going to slot in my spirituality or my kingdom side of my life in a little slot here.
But I guess I want to defend the modern church the church that I'm part of back home. Yeah, we only meet maybe once a week. There are activities going on during the week, but there are emails that we get all the time updating us on health needs or other issues within the church. We keep up with each other now. It's an electronic way of keeping in touch, that even though we're kind of spread out, you get to know each other and the needs. And then when there are needs like that, people bring meals. When there's sickness or if there's a death in the family or other needs, somebody needs a ride to a doctor, or they're constantly helping each other.
And in healthy churches, that would be the case. But you're describing the exception, not the rule.
Really? Because I've heard of other churches doing things like that.
When you start to look at the broad scope of American, and that's not to say that there aren't, but when you look at it broadly, not in a particular vein, and I would say your tradition, CRC, they do tend to be more communal because there also is an ethnic connectivity there. Lutherans sometimes are a little more communal. There's an ethnic connectivity. I think anytime you see the more communal natures of the church, it's because there's actually a cultural ethnic connection there.
Well, there's some of that, but there are also new programs that have sprung up. I don't know if you've heard of Love Inc.
We haven't.
Love in the Name of Christ, Inc., INC, in the name of Christ. And it's a program that ministers to the community and helps. They have kind of a central office, and requests come in and they respond to all kinds of needs within the community, and we work together to respond to those things. Right.
No, I'm not saying that those things aren't out there. But I also, and I think everything you described is the church's healthy response to try to figure out, when you live in a fragmented world and society and you're not even close, you're driving 45 minutes from other small groups another way. In other words, this in some sense, this is the managerial stuff. How do we manage our new cultural situation where we don't live together? We're not. And again, would I have ever, if I took an urban church or maybe an urban church, but if I took a suburban church, we wouldn't be having a conversation about this book right now. But because we are an isolated community, because we are, the very nature of CPC lends itself to some expression or connection to monasticism. So again, this is a contextual, I would never have started with this otherwise. Okay, let's do 5-minute overview of this chapter. It really is not, there's not a whole lot that is offered. It's a smaller chapter, and I'm just gonna kind of go through and highlight a few things. In this first page 57, and this is the paragraph you were talking about, correct? He basically says, and he connects it to the Roman Empire, as I said earlier. He nevertheless draws on the waning days of the Roman Empire to suggest where we may be headed in Western culture. In earlier times, he says, and this is McIntyre, not Wilson, men and women of goodwill turn aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium, meaning the institution or the government, and cease to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that imperium. In other words, at one point in Rome, by being a good Roman citizen, you were maintaining the civility and moral code of the community, because the state dictated how you had to live your life within that realm. Well, you could also argue what he's saying is that the day and age where the church and the state are synonymous is over. And now we are saying, I don't have to appeal to a single morality that is prescribed to me by my government or a denomination or a particular religion. What they set themselves to achieve instead, and he's talking about Romans at this point, often not recognizing fully what they were doing, was the construction of new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained, so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarianism and darkness. And what he's saying is that in the Roman era, that it caused some to escape this sort of growing debauchery in Rome and preserve, and he's nodding his head towards monastics, and preserve the moral and civil tradition that existed in before Rome. And then and barbarians, he would say, are individualism, relativism in terms of truth and authority and those sort of things. In other words, they're not necessary. And he does say they aren't barbarians coming in with swords and shields. They're actually often the leaders of our country. They're the ones who have brought some, if my account of our moral condition is correct, then we ought to conclude that for some time now we've reached that turning point. And I think I would argue that we have. No, none of us agree about anything. Even in this room, we're all the same, we could find all sorts of things probably morally that we disagree on. What this matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. And I happen to think that this little church in Lake City could be one of those spaces where we are a shining example, if you will, not a shining in the perfect sense, but a shining in the letting your light shine sense of a community that embodies God's kingdom differently. So that when people come here, they feel like they've walked into a Sabbath community. They feel like they've walked into something different. And when they go back to their urban or suburban or existence the rest of the year, there's a sense of what I'm doing the rest of the year doesn't feel as good as what it is when I'm here in Lake City, because when I'm in that faith community, and the part of it is that there really isn't much of a vision for an intentional lived community in our understanding of church today. But the virtues, the community, the belonging, the sense of connectivity that emerges from that sort of connection is phenomenal. It's kind of like if all you've ever had in your whole life was a hamburger, even a good hamburger, and something's like, have you ever tasted a filet mignon? And you're like, no, and then you get it, and then you see it, and you get a glimpse of it, you get a taste of it, and then all of a sudden a hamburger no longer looks the same. So this is what he's saying, that new communities emerge in these dark times to stand and to proclaim the gospel in where they are and then become exemplars for what we can do, what we can accomplish. And I do believe that within suburban and urban environments, we can have residential living communities. I think it just takes us to desire to live differently, because I see them. They are popping up, and new monastic communities and intentional Christian communities are expressions of those. Yep.
Every generation says that same thing about darkness. Oh, look at the kids today. Look at this. That has been going on from the beginning of time.
Not in the same way, because adolescence is only a concept that developed in the 1920s. We didn't, prior to the 1900s, when you were 14 or 15, you were an adult.
Which Greek philosopher those spoke about? I've heard, you maybe heard that quotation too. I forget if it was Socrates or some.
Plato.
I don't remember who it was, but he was talking about this younger generation and how they're going to the dogs, and it sounds very contemporary. But it was in the time of the Greek Empire.
Well, and they also, the funny thing about Greek, the Greek academy was they selected individuals to enter in that. It was a very elite form of sort of, and they believed that elitism would ultimately give rise to better leadership for the city. And if you have better leadership for the city, then everyone prospers out of that. But that doesn't, so my guess is they would be talking about the uneducated boys in the streets, not the the ones that form the nature of their academy.
Haven't read it.
And that's not to say that, I mean, humans are sinful in general. I mean, I'm sure that teenagers were always, the hormones of teenagers that drive them to do crazy things weren't gone in the 1900s. They just had a society and, quite frankly, work to do. I mean, you had big families when you were in the 1900s because you needed people to work the farm. And we schooled in the winter often because there was no work to do. And then we didn't have school in the summer because you were harvesting. And the whole thing got, so that's in general how we ended up with this educational system that runs through the center. And then at some point in the last 120 years, we slowly swapped everything, because we used to live in a culture where our society was busy in the summer. Everyone was busy. From April, March, April, all the way to October. November, December, January, maybe into February before you start getting ready, you just sort of dormant months. It's one of the things I love about Lake City. My summer is crazy here. My winter is dormant. I believe I am aligning myself with the ontogenesis of humanity. Last statement there. And if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we're not entirely without grounds for hope. The time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have been governing us for some time. And our lack of consciousness of that constitutes part of our predicament. We are not waiting for Godot, to reference the English playwright, but for another, doubtless very different Saint Benedict. In other words, we in our culture are looking, we are at it's that 500-year theory. Every 500 years, the church makes a major transition. And I think that transition for the church in the Western world started in the 1940s and 50s with the onset of World War II and the boom of babies and really the rise of technology and industry. And we're now, and I think COVID will function as a significant marking point for the invention or the reemergence of what spirituality is in our culture. We are more fragmented spiritually and religiously than we ever have. In part because we've aligned ourselves with the empire and not with God. So, okay, page 58. Basically on this, new monasticism is not supported by the larger society. It's going to be something strange or different. Page 59. He's basically saying the life of virtues needs a restructuring in a cultural setting to understand what those virtues are. In the second paragraph, the only way the church to recover faithful living is for the church to disentangle its life from the culture. But the problem with that is that seems like a church is then withdrawing. We don't want to do that. And I think it's interesting because I think we, to some extent here, have already done that. The church hasn't done that, but those of us who live here or decide to come here for extended periods of time are already disconnecting ourselves from mainstream culture. So it may not be motivated by a spiritual reaction, but if you're coming here for an extended period of time, not just for a week hiatus, you have made a decision to leave culture out there to come to find a place of isolation. And even though it's busy here in the summer, we're still that sense of we're away from the rest of the world. At the bottom of the last paragraph, one of the few things I will read is a quote. We have been taught to think of the church as the shaper of morality, the source of values. And this is why my generation returned, because we wanted our children to be raised morally. By thinking in this way, we've allowed the life of the church to be judged by the success and progress of civilization. So if we have a moral society, then the church is doing its job. We've affected the society at large. So any suggestion that we withdraw from the role of shaping and guiding our culture appears to be an abandonment of the mission of the church. But the question becomes, is it our job to shape the morality of a culture, or is it our job to live out our own morality?
And the answer is?
I think that by living out our own morality, we can more effectively affect the morality of the culture. And not to hit a hot button issue, and I'm not going to entertain any discussion around it, but this is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to the topic of abortion. Because as a Christian, I'm pro-life. You know, like that's a part of who I am as a Christian. But my morality cannot be imposed on someone else who does not share that morality with me, who is not a Christian, who does not profess Christ. So I can't, as a person, tell them what I think they should do or what and how they should live. That doesn't mean that I agree with abortion whatsoever. What I'm saying is that's where the conflict lies, is what does it mean to live out our own morality versus expecting our morality to define cultural morality. 60, he basically says there are 4 characteristics that will mark the church in its new monasticism. We'll go through these quickly. It's nothing new, recovering the telos. And this is a question, what is, in others, recovering the reason for living. If the reason for prior to the 1600s was to glorify God and delight in God, then not that we have to recover that. I'm not suggesting that as the absolute, but what does the CPCs tell us? Why do we exist in this place? For almost 150 years, we've been proclaiming God's mission here. Is that just it? So if we die, won't the Baptist Church do that? Won't grace still be around? Do we need to be here to exist to do that? So what is our telos? And so I think that's something, what does it tell us of Lake City as a whole? To people who come here to go to our church, or they just come here because they're like, this is where I rest and relax. And if we weren't here, they'd find another church. In other words, what is distinct? What is our calling? What is our essence of who we are? Not just to be a church in the mountains that people go to, but a community that actually is proclaiming God's kingdom. 2, monasticism is a call for all people, for all of humanity. And I make the argument that is true. I think there's a monastic in everybody, even the most gregarious extrovert. I think as human beings, there are moments where we need silence and stillness, and we need to contemplate. And sometimes we go so far from those things we don't even know. And I think that's why we come here. We want to go for the walk. We want that space to contemplate. We want the mountains to make us feel engulfed. 3, we need to be disciplined. I think this was his weakest point, but he basically relies back on the notion of the aesthete, the manager and the therapist, saying, are we just here to have a pleasurable experience, express our managerial techniques or have a peace of mind? No, we're actually called, everything in the gospel calls us to a life of a disciplined Christian community, where we show God's love in a disciplined way, where we engage in practices in a regular disciplined fashion. Small groups are a way that he basically argues that some of these disciplines come out, and he's really talking more about internal church goods. The challenge we run in is we want to proclaim the gospel. And I love that, if you're there on Sunday, Matthew comes up to the side and he's just sort of seeing what's going on. And we're making this public proclamation. But the reality is what we do as a community of faith is internally for us. It's not for the world. The minute the church engages in its worship of God for the sake of the world and not for the sake of being connected to God and that relationship that we have with God, then we have misappropriated what we're doing and almost put an outside standard or criteria that we'll be judged by. Does the world approve what we do? 4, we need to be in deeper theological reflection and commitment. And I think that the argument of that monasticism the reason we have much of our literature today is because monasteries stored and saved sacred documents. If you've ever read the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, the argument behind it is the Irish at a time of, I don't know what war they were, basically took all of the sacred archives and buried them and hid them and stole them away. In other places where things were being destroyed, the reason we have these historic documents is because they stored these. And what he's saying is we don't need to be preservers of ancient documents. We're past that point, unless we have an apocalyptic type setting where we all, everything blows up. But until that happens, we have the documents. But what does it mean for us to still engage? And I think this is what we're doing right now. This is a seminary, for those, in case you didn't realize, we're having a seminary level discussion, which is good. We should be having these discussions. And you hired a theologian as your pastor, and that's what I told you that when you hired me, I'm going to teach. So this, so, and basically saying new monastic communities are a means of recovering this intellectual witness. And you remember when I said earlier that it was the intellectuals from the mainline denominations that wanted to do the emerging church thing? These are just the contemplative intellectuals that come into this tradition. Page 63, he basically says old monasticism was separated by, should we be separated? How does new monasticism separate itself from society? He said that that it should be characterized by liberty and discernment to allow us to figure out what it is. And that's why I'm saying, as much as I have some convictions around this, I'm not here to impose this on any of you. I'm here to teach you about it. And if it resonates with you, as it has resonated with me, then we can then we can actually start to put some pieces together. Two, that we should always be subordinate to the larger church. And I think that we are, in particular within, when you're in a denomination, it's easier to do that because I am always accountable to somebody. Everyone is accountable to somebody. And three, the division between sacred and secular are blurred, so to speak. In other words, it's not like this is one and this is the other, but all of our life becomes sacred. And then he does do the afterwards. And the afterwards, he basically is just giving some thought to new monastics about how they might go about living and some dangers they might face. He talks about a rule. A rule is something that monastic communities live by. It's kind of like a social contract or a covenant that says this is, if to put it in boomer terms, it's a mission statement that's been fleshed out. But that's what a mission statement is. It's a statement that says who we are and how we're going to live our lives together. Benedict, we should read that sometime. St. Benedict's Rule is a fascinating book because it goes into the very deep, small, minute details of how we ought to live together. But a rule is, when I wrote my dissertation, I wrote my dissertation based to address what happens when pilgrims go to Taizé, have this incredible transformative experience, and then leave, and nothing else happens after that. And what I suggest, and so I was addressing the 100,000 pilgrims that were leaving every year, coming and going, and how they should sustain that. And my suggestion was the concept of a rule of life. How do we live our lives together? What does it mean to be a part of a community? To exist, because what that does is it guides you. And you might say, well, how does that work with someone who doesn't live here? Well, Benedictine oblates are a third order of monasticism. So if this was the monastic community and this was an oblate, and they lived over here in Seattle, and this was in the middle of Idaho, they would go to Idaho every now and then. They would visit the monastic community, and then they would go back to their own life. But while they were back here, they lived by a modified version of that rule, that it was adapted to their life. There are more, what they're called Benedictine oblates. Ed Nettleton is one. There are more Benedictine, it's the largest growing facet of monasticism in the history of the world, because there are more people saying, I want these rhythms, I want this connection, I want this meaning, I want my life to be connected to something. So they're connecting themselves to these small communities, and then they visit them and they contribute to them when they're there, and then they go, and they still live by, it could be like reading a lectionary together. We're all going to read the same thing. So if all 120 of us in this church committed one year to say, you know what, every day we're going to read the same passages together. Some of us may chit chat with one another, and hopefully we're all more intersecting. But if we were all doing that, even if you were away, you would feel like you were being connected to what was happening here because you knew that we were all reading these things together. It could be if you were up in Denver at noon, when we were gathering to pray, you paused, and for 15 minutes you sat in silence, or and then you knew in solidarity that you had brothers and sisters here in this community doing the same thing. And that has a powerful effect of shaping who you are and how you understand your place in this world. All of a sudden, it's not just about your own existence, who you are, but who you are in relationship to one another. Dangers, he says, communal egotism, that we got it right, danger of utopian, that everything is perfect, romanticism, that everything could be perfect, utilitarianism, that we're meeting the needs of society, and Pelagianism, that we have done this ourselves. Things that we don't need to talk about now, really. They're really written for monastic communities. And I think that what happened was, again, new monastic communities grabbed this book. And so he's writing this with explicitly these small little cluster communities in mind. So that sense of, they need to just sort of check themselves, and that's really it. I mean, that's the end of the book. There wasn't there, the last stuff really isn't relevant to us. The overall argument is that what does it look like for CPC to be a community that exists as a proclamation of what God's kingdom is in this world in such a way that our light shines? And I already think it does. And I think it does for a lot of things that don't relate to Christianity or our faith witness. It's just this community shines for all sorts of reasons. But I think how amazing, what a collective vision that is to say that this church is not just the historic church on the Western Slope, but this church is an example of a living community of God's kingdom on earth. All right. Done.
I think sometimes all you can do is set a good example, and if that's the best that the influence you can have, then that's gotta be good enough.
And I think if you feel those connections and you feel the value and feel the goodness of being in a community, I think that we do have that here. I think that spreads. I think I experience that every Sunday night at the Hyperman. You can feel the tangible goodness of that space and that interaction and that ministry and that love and all of that's there. And if we experience that in our common life together more often, a deeper connection, then I think that does, it changes the way we live.
Another way that has happened this year, and it's very, a small group, but we have felt that by doing that Bible study through the whole book, going through the whole, and especially during those difficult COVID months last year, where every Wednesday we knew we were taking a chunk of the Old Testament and working our way, and we both said that has really had an influence on us. But it was a very, very small part of this church, but we felt very connected to this church because of that. And in previous years, we'd be connected here in the summer, but we really didn't have much contact throughout the year like that.
I had a hiker tell me, she just kind of went on and on about how great it was.